at you.
Hello and welcome to Hey Ask Me Stuff, the show where you, the viewer, get to ask me stuff. My name is Ken Coughlin. I am a Christian apologist and I work with Trinity Lutheran Church in Joppa, Maryland. And back there behind the glass is...
B.A. Thomas, how's it going?
And B.A. Thomas is our producer extraordinaire on the program. So if it's your first time joining us here for Hey Ask Me Stuff, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us. Let me tell you a little bit about what it's all about. Essentially, the way this show works is we get questions from you, the viewers, whether it be being submitted to us online or in other manners. And we take those questions and we answer them to the best of our ability here on the program. Now, if you are interested, if you have some question about the Bible, about Jesus, about God, about anything that's really been on your minds and puzzling you, and you want it to be considered to be one of our topics here on Hey Ask Me Stuff, the way you get it on our show is, well, number one, you can go to our website, trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff, where there is a form that you can fill out with whatever your question may be, and you can get it on that way. Another way you can do it is through Reddit. We have a subreddit called Talk About God, where we will post questions. Usually that might be because someone has inspired us with a general question and we want to get some more people's thoughts about it. And so we'll post little prompts on that subreddit. We also go to the Christianity subreddit sometimes and post in there, and maybe a couple others that I'm forgetting about. But if you find one of our posts there on Reddit, we are Trinity Joppa on Reddit. And then you can answer the prompt there, and that also will get your thoughts shared here on the show. Hey, third way you can actually get your thoughts answered on the show is by, well, watching the show, because we are live every Wednesday at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. And if you're watching us live, then you can comment live, whether you're watching us on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel or the Trinity Joppa Facebook page. I have a computer right here in front of me, and I know how to use it. And so I have tabs open for both the YouTube stream and the Facebook stream. And so if you make a comment on either one, I will see it there and we can read it out on the air. Mr. Thomas back there as well can, if he notices, can alert me if I've missed something. So that's how you get your comment on the air. If you do like what we're doing here today, we're going to ask you to please go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Lots of great content here on the Trinity Joppa channel. Like the video, comment below. Even if you're not watching us live, we'd like to hear what your thoughts are on our topic of the week. So put your comments down there in the comment section, and of course share the video with as many people as possible. So I will start off letting you know kind of what the background is for our topic for this week. Our topic this week is, does God value men more than women? And this actually came to me not through the usual channels. This wasn't a question that arose from Reddit or from our website. It was actually an in-person question. It wasn't even that particular question. It was somebody had come up to me and asked me about my thoughts on a specific Bible passage, a couple of verses in 1 Timothy, which we'll get to in a minute. And so when I was looking at the verses in question, I thought, oh, okay, well, this might be a good opportunity to take this question that was asked of me and turn it into an episode of Hey Ask Me Stuff. So that's kind of where it started. And so from there, we took this kind of general idea and we asked for more people's thoughts on Reddit about, well, what other Bible passages, other than this one that I was specifically asked about, what other ones kind of bother you or bother people that you know of that have talked to you about it, that they find a little bit more problematic, all under the umbrella of the value that God places upon men and women. You'll hear Christians all the time say that God values men and women equally. Some people look at some Bible scriptures and say, well, that doesn't appear to be true. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And before I get into the 1 Timothy passage, I want to give some general thoughts about what the Bible does say about the equality of male and female. And then we'll address that 1 Timothy passage. And then I'm going to ask Mr. Thomas back there to kind of pick some things from that we got on Reddit, some other Bible passages that people have brought up, and we'll just address some of the other ones that people found challenging. So, and if there's something in particular that you're watching the show live and you find challenging, put it in the comments section. And if we have time, we will get to that as well. We'd love to interact with you. So, like I mentioned a second ago, Christians everywhere, obviously you'll hear them say that God values men and women equally. They both have equal worth in his eyes. Why do we say that? Well, I mean, it was literally that way from creation. If you look back at, Genesis chapter 1, I'm going to read verses 26 and 27. It says, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So yes, mankind is just, that's an old NIV. Some people would say humankind, because clearly what we see in the context, especially when we get to the end, he says male and female, he created them. Both males and females were equally created in God's image. When we look at the original creative act, it was of both males and females, and both are spoken of in the same terms of both being created in God's image. Not one with a little more image than the other one, all right? No hints of anything like that, all right? But it's not just that. There's plenty of other passages as well. Another example from Genesis chapter 2, verses 24, still in that Garden of Eden time frame. It says, "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." It doesn't say a man leaves his father. It says a man leaves his father and mother and becomes united to his wife in one flesh. Exodus 20, verse 12, "Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you." Leviticus 19:13, "Each of you must respect your mother and father." Now, mother actually gets mentioned first this time around, okay? Proverbs 6:20, "My son, keep your father's command and do not forsake your mother's teaching." So now all of a sudden it's not just respecting your mother, but it's actually, hey, son, male, you need to learn something from your female mother, okay? I could go on and on. There's lots of other passages like that. But what we see is repeatedly throughout the Bible, men and women are both spoken of in these kind of equal value terms. And then we also see a number of examples of very powerful women in the Bible. I'll see a lot of people that will challenge me and say, well, if God really values men and women equally, then why aren't there any women in the Bible? Why don't we see any stories of powerful women and women religious leaders and stuff in the Bible? And my response to that is, have you read the Bible? Because there are plenty of them in there. I mean, you've got Shiphrah and Puah, maybe some of the earliest references. You don't know those names? Well, you probably know what they did. Those were the two Hebrew midwives who defied Pharaoh's order in Egypt to kill every baby that was born to the Hebrew women. They took their life in their own hands. They ended up saving Moses as a result. You've got Deborah, who was a prophet and a judge. Understand that in the book of Judges, the judges weren't just these judicial leaders or that were deciding cases. They did do that, but they were the actual rulers of Israel during that time. This is before there were kings, all right? So we have Deborah, who was actually a ruler of Israel and also described as being a prophet at that point in time. You've got the whole book of Esther that's describing how Esther boldly goes before King Xerxes at risk of her own life, mind you, in order to persuade him that he'd been tricked by his vizier, and she actually saves the lives of the Jewish people. Well, there's another Jewish woman that's held very, very highly in the Bible. Then, of course, you've got, I could go on. Miriam, Moses' sister, was described as a prophet. Huldah in 2 Kings 22, described as a prophet. Anna, a prophet in Luke chapter 2. And, of course, no discussion of the prominent role played by women would be complete unless we mention the fact that God gave the ultimate honor in the entire Bible to women, not men, and that was to be the very first witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Even in a culture, mind you, that female witnesses would not have helped God send his message out there, okay? Because females at the time were their testimony just wasn't considered worth anything. And yet God still said no, but it's going to be women that the angel is going to speak to first. It's going to be women that are actually going to discover this empty tomb first. And so we do have this overarching theme of equality throughout the Bible. Now, another factor that we need to consider before we start looking at these particular passages is the culture that God was dealing with. Is it true that ancient Israel was very patriarchal? Yes. Is it true that ancient Israel had a lot of sexist practices? Yes, absolutely. All right. It obviously also influenced by the cultures around it, but that's what the culture was at the time. So in that type of environment, all right, if God isn't satisfied with that, all right, God wants to move his people away from this sexist culture and into one that promotes equality between male and female, equality of value, equality of worth between male and female. How's the best way to do that? If he just comes down and by judicial fiat says, don't do it, is it going to be? Are all the Israelites going to say, "Oh, okay, God, good, we're great, we're gonna go ahead and change our ways right now"? No, not likely. If, however, God starts laying down more specific things, individual things that he tells the Jewish people he wants them to do, and those things are leading them along a path towards realizing that there's equality between male and female, and that he wants them to treat each other equally, then that is the type of thing that starts to slowly move a culture. It's kind of like a very famous quote that I mention all the time. I probably mentioned on the show before by Andrew Fletcher. "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws." And basically what he's saying is if you want to influence a culture from his perspective, you're not going to do it by passing a law, by mandating something from somebody. That's not what gets changed, what promotes change. What he's saying, you can really effectively promote change through the arts. Why is that? Because people will go to it for entertainment, not necessarily even realize that they're being influenced and having some kind of philosophy shown to them. And if you do that enough times, you can gradually change the feelings of a culture. It's not like you're going to make one single movie and all of a sudden you can see a huge cultural shift. But if you make a series of movies that all are communicating this philosophical message, then gradually over time, you start to see a culture buying into that message. The same basic principle we're talking about here that you can see God doing in the Bible is he's taking a series of steps to gradually influence the culture toward a point of equality. All right. Those are my general thoughts. All right. I want to next go into the specific passage that I was asked about, and then we'll field the ones that were brought up to us on Reddit and anything else that comes up online if people have specific questions they want to ask us about online. Now, I'm going to do my best, but I apologize. I dropped my glasses, so we'll see if I can still read or not, because I can't reach them. So the specific passage I was asked about was from 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 8. Now, I was asked first about verses 8 and 9, but I actually want to read on the next couple of verses as well, because I think the thought continues there. And just so you know, this is Paul speaking to his this young Timothy, his follower, his student Timothy, who is leading churches. He's basically like a young pastor figure, all right, and kind of giving him some instruction about how to go about doing that. All right. Now, he's at the beginning of chapter 2. He's starts out by talking about the attitude of what we should be praying for, what our attitude in the church should be. And one thing he says to begin with is he wants us all praying for our leaders, all right, so that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all goodness and holiness, all right. Then he goes on in verse 8, he says this: "I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands in prayer without anger or disputing. I also want women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God." All right, I am going to fetch my glasses here. Excuse me for a second. Hopefully I won't turn off any lights.
We are currently experiencing visual difficulties.
Visual difficulties, yes. Well, okay. You ever try to read a Bible, first of all, if you need glasses without it, but then you got the study notes and everything underneath it that they decide to put, hey, you thought we couldn't print anything smaller than what we're printing your Bible text in? Oh, hold my beer. And then they go and they print the study notes even smaller.
Yeah.
So anyway, so the question that was asked to me specifically was about those two verses. You've got verse 8, which is talking to men and saying, I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands in prayer without anger or disputing. And then in verse 9, you've got addressing women, saying, I want women to dress modestly with decency, propriety, not the braided hair, not the golden pearl or expensive clothes. And so the first question I think that comes when you see that is this demonstrating some type of gender inequality? An inequality, we're saying men do this, women do this. Well, no. All right. just because you're addressing different thoughts to different groups doesn't mean that you're valuing those different groups any differently. It could just be that there are specific things that were prominent in the first century church that were going on in those groups, that is what, Paul meant to address. Let's say Paul, for example, didn't want anyone dressing with big giant braided hair. Why? I mean, first of all, why is he saying that? Think about it for a second. Don't we still have this problem today? I mean, where does our real value lie? On the outside or on the inside? And yet we try to ornament ourselves, to decorate ourselves, to make ourselves look good, to frankly fool. It's the Pollyannaism, right? To try to make everything look perfect and beautiful. And, you even talk about people taking selfies. Well, if I were to ask people watching out there, what is the best camera angle, best way to hold your phone to take a selfie? How many of you would know the answer to that? BA, do you know the answer to that?
I do.
What's the answer to that?
Well, actually, hold on. It recently changed.
It did.
This. Yeah. I thought it was always above. Hold on. Let me demonstrate. I thought it was always above, looking down to slim the face. But apparently now women want a larger bottom half. Mm-hmm. So you have to bring the camera down very slightly to make the jowls and chin slightly larger than the top of the head. So I knew.
Well, there you go. See, I was not aware of the update. I was aware of the original one.
Recent change. It's okay.
Why do we even have those expectations in the first place? I mean, that's exactly what Paul's getting at. I mean, why he's talking about that. We have newsflash for you. I mean, ladies, you are judged by your physical appearance. You shouldn't be, but our culture still does it. And guess what? They were doing it 2,000 years ago, too, that these women felt like they had to decorate themselves in such a way. And Paul's trying to tell them, no, your value is from within, not without, all right? So you shouldn't be worrying about things like that. God doesn't value your hair. He values you, all right? Now, if that is not a problem that men at the time were experiencing, in other words, men aren't going around braiding their hair to try to, create better impressions of themselves. This wasn't something that was culturally happening. Then why would Paul tell them, and men, don't forget, don't braid your hair? All right. There's no context for him to do that. No, it's not necessary for him to do that. It doesn't mean just because he's giving two pieces of advice that he's valuing men and women differently. It just means that there are different issues that were common in the church at the time that Paul felt needed to be addressed. All right. So that in and of itself in verses 8 and 9 certainly does not show any type of inequality. It's just that these are things that were happening. And Paul was trying to tell these women in this particular circumstance to look for where their real value is. God doesn't look to the outside. God looks to the inside. All right. But wait, there's more. It gets more interesting if we keep reading in the following verses, because then we get to the passage, frankly, that I'm asked about more often. It starts in verse 11. Yeah. Says, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. All right, that's verses 11 and 12 in there. Oh, wait a minute, Ken. Now we're talking about women. It's just saying that you need to be a quiet little woman away in the corner and keep your mouth shut, No. All right, this is why one of the things I always teach in my Bible classes, whenever I teach a Bible class, is context, context, context. All right. There's different ways you can look at the surrounding context of a verse. I mean, Greg Koukl is very famous for saying never read a Bible verse. And what he means by that is never read just a verse in isolation. You ought to read the verses beforehand, afterwards. But you want to do more than that. You also have to understand the original context in which it was written. All right? Because all of these books in the New Testament, all of these letters, we have to remember, they weren't written specifically to us. Now, there are universal principles in there that can still apply to us, absolutely. But they're letters, just like letters you write today, written to particular people or particular churches to address particular issues that are going on, all right? We need to know what that context was so that we don't misinterpret what the author is trying to say, all right? Now, people here, it's funny how now, 2,000 years later, we look at those verses and we immediately get drawn to those words quiet and submission, all right? You know what? 2,000 years ago, what word they probably would have been more drawn to? Learn. Because women in that culture weren't allowed to learn, okay? I mean, you've got to understand, the first thing that Paul is doing, number one, is saying women are allowed to learn. And it's almost like an afterthought. He's just acknowledging this is an openly obvious thing that, yes, of course, women are allowed to learn. All right. So that's the first clue to something that we're missing, is that we look at things through our 21st century eyes instead of looking at it in the context of what it was back then. And that leads to misinterpretation. Now we're so focused on, well, they have to do it in quietness and submission, we lose sight of just how profound and what a big deal it was that Paul was saying women had a right to learn right alongside the men. Now, the next question then becomes, remember I told you these books are always written for specific needs, for a specific purpose. People will look at this and say, well, Paul's clearly saying that women aren't allowed to teach. They're not allowed to teach, at least, in churches. They can't. Now, understand that the church culture, the church procedure at the time was very different from what we see today. You think today we kind of have, the band goes up and plays, or the choir goes up and sings, and then the pastor comes up and the pastor gives the message, and they're pretty much the only one that's doing any kind of a teaching moment during the worship service. And then maybe we have some more music, or maybe we just go home. That's not the way church operated back then in these little house churches. It was actually a series of people would get up and they would talk. All right. So you would have one person get up and teach, and then someone else would get up and teach, and then someone else would get up and teach. Well, sometimes the people that would want to get up and teach would be women. So is Paul in this particular letter saying that women in the first century should not be allowed to teach at all? They shouldn't be allowed to get up and teach because there's something sexist about it? Women shouldn't be able to teach men. Men shouldn't have to learn from women. Well, again, you can't read just even this book in isolation. That obviously can't be the case, because we see other passages in the Bible where the opposite is true. You've got Paul. Let me make sure I got everything right here. All right. Paul had a co-worker named Priscilla. That's a woman. All right. Who we read in Acts chapter 18 taught Apollos. Apollos is this great preacher that's held up. All right. Well, guess what? He learned from a woman, from Priscilla, who was one of Paul's students. All right. So obviously, Paul can't be setting down some universal rule that women aren't allowed to teach. All right. Because he did allow women to teach in certain circumstances. So what is Paul saying? Well, we don't know exactly. We don't know the specific context of the churches that Timothy was ministering to. But clearly what we can see here is this is something where Paul is communicating to Timothy about a specific need in this particular church. And I'm just going to throw out one possible explanation to you. Do I know this is definitely what was going on in that church? No, but it's a possible one. Who do you want to be your teachers in church? People who are experienced Christians, more experienced Christians, or less experienced Christians? Okay, I'm going to assume you all said more experienced, right? The ones that know more what the truth is. You don't want somebody who just became a Christian yesterday, who doesn't know any of the deeper truths, start getting up and talking to you about transubstantiation versus consubstantiation. They don't know what they're talking about. There's a really cool commercial, and now I'm forgetting who it's for. That means maybe it's not as good of a commercial, where it's a news show, and you know what I'm talking about, where they're trying to cut to this financial expert, but he's not there, and his dad comes on and starts talking instead. It's like, I'll fill in. And here's a good tip. Never hide your crypto under your mattress. It's like, he doesn't know what the heck he's talking about. All right. In that commercial, who would you rather learn from? The son who's actually the financial expert, or the dad who thinks crypto is something you can put under your mattress? All right. Remembering again that we just saw that Paul was telling that these women, they were allowed to learn. And in that culture, women generally weren't allowed to learn. It's entirely possible that in the churches that Timothy was ministering to, that Paul was giving him advice about, that the women were, frankly, newer believers, that they didn't have the education base to get up and teach because they hadn't learned. They were just starting their learning process. Do I know for sure that's what was going on? No, I don't. But I do know enough from reading the context to know that Paul can't be just laying down some universal rule that women aren't ever allowed to teach, because we do see examples of, for example, Priscilla, who was a student of Paul, teaching Apollos. So women teaching men is not outright banned in the Bible. That opinion may make me unpopular with some, but that's what I see. So that's the First Timothy passage that kind of addressed some male and female inequality. B.A., I'm going to throw things to you now to take a look at the other questions and other Bible passages that were brought up on Reddit that people found problematic, and tell me what one you think we should go into next.
Well, I think we should start at the top.
I can't hear you. Are you on air? Or
I am
are you
on
not
air.
in my ear?
That's a problem. Can
That's
you
a problem?
seriously not hear me?
I can't hear you, but are you on the air?
I am on the air.
You are on the air. I've got a green light.
I'll just have to shout. Not to you guys, to him.
That's weird. Open the door, and I'll just be able to hear you that way.
Yeah.
Just don't let anybody else walk into the room.
Nobody else? Better be out there. All right. We're going to start at the very beginning, at the top, with Tailwriter. Tailwriter says, Leviticus 27, 1 through 8 breaks it down as follows. There are a bunch of numbers that I'm about to say, but just kind of imagine a chart on the left for guys and a chart on the right for girls. 20 to 60-year-old male, 50 shekels of silver. Female, 30 shekels. 5 to 20-year-old male, 20 shekels. Female, 10 shekels. It's a comparison of what appears to be age ranges and how much that person is worth. I did a little homework on my own, or work, because I didn't go home.
Work is good. Preparation is good. Yes.
It seems to be how much a person should pay to have this person be dedicated to the church in some sort of ritual that I'm not familiar with, because it's not something we do today.
Right.
But it sounds like, hey, I want my cousin Vinny to belong to the church. How much should I pay?
Did you really say my cousin Vinny?
I did say my cousin Vinny.
Do you really expect me not to go, my biological clock is ticking like this, and at this rate, we ain't never getting married. I love that movie.
Yeah, many people love it. Many people love it. But
Everybody that was watching just stopped.
how many shekels would he have been worth? You pay like 20 shekels because he's getting up there. He's between the ages of what, 20 and 60. I'm sorry, no, 50 shekels.
Yeah, wow.
So there you go. You got to pay 50 shekels to dedicate your cousin Vinny to the church. So it's a chart. It's literally a chart of they pay this much. Now, if it was my cousin Vignette, I guess, then you would pay 30 shekels. And there's a disparity there of 20 shekels worth. Why? The question is from what we've been talking about earlier. Why is Vinny worth 50, but Vignette worth 30?
Good question. All right. And this, again, gets back to the same principle we were talking about. I taught a class a few years back called Cracking Open the Hard Parts of the Bible. And what I did in there is I talked about not just several of these difficult passages, but a specific strategy for how to address them. Because I think, and I got a book that I'm still working on that I want to try to get out there to get this out in the world, because I think a shortcoming of the resources that are available to Christians. We have all sorts of Christian resources and books that will look at individual passages and give you explanations. But I think we need something more than that. We need to understand. We need to have some guiding principles so that we can learn to do that on our own. That every time we come across a difficult passage, we don't need to look it up in a book somewhere. We can apply these certain principles and maybe get some clues as far as where the answers may be. And one of those principles was that context thing that I talked about in regard to the last verse, is always understand a verse in its historical, cultural, and literary context. And the same thing holds true here. You want to understand whether this is really a discussion of value, of worth, then you need to understand what's going on. And like you yourself said, this isn't something we do in the church, so I'm not as familiar with it. Well, you're right. And the mistake a lot of people make is they're not familiar with something, and they then draw conclusions still based upon it, even though they don't understand what they're reading. How about the first step would be figure out what's going on? So here's what is going on in Leviticus. We're all familiar, or at least most of us are probably familiar with the Old Testament sacrificial system, that before Jesus came around, that you had to pay the price for your sins, and you had to make an offering and sin offerings, and there were different fellowship offerings and different types of offerings that they could make. Well, those offerings were required by the law, all right? But you could, if you wanted to, it was not required, it was not mandated, you could make some kind of additional offerings. And those offerings could be of your own service. Then maybe I want to dedicate myself to the temple, for example, all right? They could be of animals, they could be of things, they could be of a lot of different things, all right? But what would happen, let's say that I've dedicated myself to the temple service, all right? Mm-hmm. And I say, I'm going to come and I'm just going to serve at the temple. About a year later, I think, boy, was that a mistake. I don't like the sight of blood, and all these sacrifices are making me vomit, okay? I don't want to do this anymore, all right? But I've made a commitment, all right? I made a commitment. How do I get out of it, All right. Well, the Bible, the book of Leviticus, would assign monetary values to basically buy your way out of your commitment, so to speak. So what's really going on here, all right, is you're not saying this is how much this life is worth. It's essentially the value of wages for work that was performed, all right? Which is why, for example, you will notice on the grand scale that newborns, you don't have to pay as much to get out of as someone who is a full-grown adult, able-bodied adult who can help out with a sacrifice and can haul a giant bull into the altar, okay?
Noted.
Because they're going to be able to do more. Is this gender-based? Well, yes, adult women you don't have to pay as much. And that's the other thing that I find kind of interesting, that people think this is a matter of value and this is a matter of sexism. Actually, it's easier to buy a woman out of her commitment than it is to buy a man. All right. So if anything, if this is sexist, it's sexist the other way around. All right. Because the higher value is placed on, if you want to call it that, the higher price is placed on a man. And if you understand the context of what was going on at the time, and this is what it was for, is to use, and I say to buy them out, not necessarily, you could also do an offering like this without making the commitment in the first place. In other words, let's say you say, I want to make this offering to the church of the equivalent of my service, but instead of my actual service, I'm going to pay you the money. You could do that too. All right. But it was used for that, to get out of the service commitment that you already made. It was actually easier to get a woman out of that service than it was to get a man out of that service. But also, as a practical matter, women in this society, where it was a physical labor-based society in large part, yes, that's partially why you had to pay more to get a man out of that service than a woman get out of that service, because there was more things that a man was physically capable of doing, or frankly, even legally able to do under that system. We already kind of talked about the culture at the time, than a woman was able to do. And so that's why you would have to pay more to get an adult male. But how do we also know it's not sexist, aside from the fact that it's actually would be reverse sexism, if you want to call it that, is because it's not just straight up male, female, all right? You pay less to get a younger male out than you do a more full-grown female. All right, so you actually have to pay more for the female there than you do have to get like a teenager male. I can't remember where the age distinctions are. All right, and so it's not purely gender-based. All right, it's based upon the ability of this individual. Basically, the value of the wage. If it were wages, the value of the wages that this person would earn, or the value of the labor that they were promised to perform. All right. So it's not it says, this passage says nothing about value or worth. It's not literally setting a price on human life. It's setting a price on labor. All right, labor costs, and that's essentially what it's talking about here.
Okay.
All right.
Learn something new.
You got another one for me, or a question on that one, or another verse?
Oh, okay. So this one from Iajak. Yeah, I'm going to pronounce it like that because I don't remember how else to pronounce it. It's Iaojac. You can correct me in the chat. Who can find a virtuous wife, begins this verse, for her worth is far above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. That's Proverbs 31, 10 through 11 in the New King James.
Yeah, and this is followed up by the comment by, what's this guy? Would that I knew, because when I first read this one, I was like, well, why are you saying that, calling a wife virtuous and saying she has value above rubies, why are you saying this causes you problems with, unless you're trying to say that it's showing that women are more valuable than men? I mean, because this is praising the value of women. But I realized as we looked at more of the discussion, what the objection is with would that I knew. It says, but if you go on to read the rest of that proverb, because that's just the beginning of the description of a valuable woman.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to say all these other things. And would that I knew says, well, that passage clearly suggests that a woman's worth comes from her virtue, which it goes on to specify almost entirely in terms of domestic servitude. So the suggestion here is that this proverb goes on to say, oh, a woman is so valuable, she's more valuable than rubies as long as she can cook, clean, and keep a good house, and take care of the kids, is essentially the suggestion that's being made. And this is one where, again, always read a verse in its historic culture and literary context and its surrounding context, its textual context, for lack of a better word. That was another principle that we had in there, is not just the historical and cultural, but also textual context, meaning the verses before, the verses after. Sometimes people say things, and this is going to be a shocker to a lot of people out there, I know. Sometimes people say things that are just plain wrong. They're just wrong, all right? And all you need to do is read. Never take people at their word when they say, well, this Bible passage says X. You know what you should do? Read the Bible passage. See if it says X. Are there things in this proverb that we would consider domestic? Yes. There are some. Yeah. Again, the culture at the time. And people want to impose our modern day cultural norms upon something 2,000 years ago. And I'm not going to go into that in detail. Understand that it was a very different society back then. Okay? You didn't have telephones. You didn't have cell phones. You didn't have telecommuting. You didn't have daycare centers to take care of kids during the day. None of that existed. All right? So you say, well, were there, was it a sexist because women were expected to stay home and take care of the kids? Well, someone had to. All right? Because we didn't have child care centers. You didn't have kinder care 2,000 years ago. All right? Someone's got to stay home and take care of the kids. Someone else has to be willing to go off and fight wars. Okay? It's not, I'm sorry, people can hate all they want on me, but I don't think it's that large of a leap to jump to realize which way societies are going to go in those circumstances. Okay? Who do you want picking up the swords and fighting? Who do you want staying home and watching the kids? All right? Now, as technology has advanced, as our cultures have advanced, and we have gotten into these things where we have daycare centers and things like that, should we still continue to apply those same principles? No, but we don't live in the same world they did back then. All right. So yes, some of what is described in this proverb talks about the fact that yes, this is what women's role included. I don't want to say was, it included at that time, and therefore doing a good job of it is a compliment, just like saying at that time a man was a good soldier would be a compliment because that's what he was called upon to do in the realities of their culture. But where I say it's just plain wrong is just read the proverb. It's just plain not true that proverb describes this woman purely as a domestic servant, so to speak. I mean, we get into verse 16, same passage talking about this virtuous woman. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. That doesn't sound like domestic servitude. That's not keeping and cleaning. That's acknowledging that she has her own money and she can go out and find a field of her own and she can buy it and she can make a vineyard out of it. All right. That's a pretty good entrepreneur there in my book. Verse 18, she sees that her trading is profitable. Trading, T-R-A-D-I-G. And her lamp does not go out at night. So she's constantly working. She's engaging in commerce. She's engaging in trade on her own. And I will say I had a little bit of an exchange with this Wood That I Knew on Reddit because he was talking about, he elaborated, he or she, I apologize, I don't want to be saying the wrong thing there, but they said that elaborate on domestic servitude included various different things, including sewing. All right. Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the thoughts. Okay, but let's look at how it describes sewing. In verse 24, she makes linen garments and sells them and supplies the merchants with sashes. All right. And so we see a number of things. Oh, another one in here also. I wanted to mention this one. Where is it? I think I don't know if I highlighted this one. Somewhere in here, it also talks about her as being a respected teacher and a wise teacher. And so these are things like, this is not domestic servitude. Yes, that was part of what women did at that time. And so if doing a good job, it was praiseworthy. But obviously, this was actually elevating women to a degree that was unheard of in a lot of the surrounding cultures. The fact you're lifting women up and saying, not just that they can own property. I mean, do you understand what a big deal that was just to say in this proverb that women were capable of owning their own property, okay? But that they could engage in commerce, they could engage in trade, they could go out and make their own earnings. I mean, this proverb is actually dramatically lifting up women. And so to sit here and suggest that it's just telling the little women to stay at home and live a life of domestic servitude, sometimes you just can't say anything other than, did you read it? All right, because that's just plain wrong. I always say people are entitled to their own opinions. They're not entitled to their own facts. All right, the facts are the facts. Draw your opinions based on the facts. But you can't do what this person obviously did, which is to look through this proverb, just pick out the certain verses that you think support some preconceived conclusion you want to be true, and ignore all those that go against that preconceived conclusion, and in this case, frankly, directly contradict it. So, all right. Trevor Gaddis is watching us on YouTube. Says, hi, Mr. Coughlin. Hello, Trevor. Trevor is one of our 8th graders here at Trinity. Thank you very much for watching.
Hey, Trevor, how's it going?
All right. So let us go on here. We got one more, right, BA? And it's a big one. It's a doozy. You saved the best for last. Do you realize that?
I really did, yeah.
All right. So what's this last one say?
The last one says, telling someone that they have to be submissive is not showing equal treatment.
All right. Well, if you didn't catch the reference, and this was from a
secular Buddhist.
A secular Buddhist, yes. And we're not saying that's descriptive. That's actually their handle. I don't know what you call it on Reddit.
Yeah, handle's fine.
Yeah,
Name,
okay.
Avatar, whatever.
If you didn't get the reference, this is a reference to Ephesians chapter 5, rather, which I'll read here in a moment. But I want to hint at something that I found interesting in the way that a secular Buddhist phrased that. Telling someone that they have to be submissive is not showing equal treatment. Do we always need to treat people equally in order to acknowledge that they have the same value? Okay? Let's say that, and this is an example that I know a lot of, I'm not going to get political here, but let's just say a lot of people in the political arena like to use, is I've got 3 people. One is 4 feet tall, one is 5 feet tall, one is 6 feet tall. They're all trying to look over a fence. All right? I can walk them up, give them equal access to all walk up to that fence. All right? But if I don't give let's say it's a 5-foot fence. All right? The only one that's going to be able to see over it is a 6-footer. All right? The other 2 aren't going to be able to see over the fence. All right? I'm treating them equally, though. Am I treating, if the goal was to get them to see what's on the other side of the fence, though, am I treating them respectfully, especially if I have 2 step stools? You know, you want to say I can treat them equally, then I don't have to give them those step stools. All right. But if I value all of them equally and really want them all to be able to see over that fence, then I'm not going to treat them equally. I'm going to give step stools to the ones who can't see over the fence, but I'm not going to give it to the 6-footer who can see over the fence.
Yep.
So you don't need to, treating people the same equally, as a secular Buddhist put it, is not synonymous with valuing them the same. All right. And that's something our culture gets tied up in an awful lot. I think that we get our minds wrapped around that, if we value someone equally, then we must always treat them equally. Well, no, not necessarily true. We're all individuals. We have different needs. We need to acknowledge that. But let's get to the actual passage, shall we? Because it's a fun one. All right. And this is Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 22. It says, "Wives, submit to your husband as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything." I'm going to stop there for a second. I'm not going to read the next verse because the next verse might spoil something. Because frankly, most people, when they raise this objection, that is where they stop and that's where they look at. Wives, submit to your husbands. All right. And so people will look at this and say, well, this just sets up patriarchy, and it sets up a situation where women always have to submit to their husbands, and it allows, frankly, abusive relationships. That's the implication that people raise, that they want to, it allows husbands to just do whatever they want, and women just, you have to submit. Bible says so. Jay Jackson here on YouTube also says, equality is being invited to the dance. Inclusion is dancing with them all. I like that analogy. I like that's saying. That's pretty cool. Yes, absolutely. It doesn't mean you have to treat them all the same. Sometimes you do. Sometimes, if you really value them equally, then you're going to treat them differently because you value them equally, and they're not in equal standing. Otherwise, for one reason or another. So the first thing we need to understand, though, about this passage from Ephesians, like I said, is the fact that, people think that this is promoting almost abusive relationships. Actually, the exact opposite is true. All right. Understanding context. The Bible does not say, for example, that women need to stay in abusive relationships. It does not say, for example, that women need to submit to their husbands in all things, always, all the time, everywhere. Number one, the number one example of this is it obviously says that everything the Bible tells us to to obey, whether it be even the authorities here on earth, all right? If the President of the United States tells you to go out and curse God, do you think you're supposed to do that just because the Bible says to respect your earthly authorities? No, because there's a higher authority, and that is God. And so all of these other commands are still subservient, still fall under the overarching command to to hold God above all else, to obey God above all else. All right. So even this command that is saying, wives, submit to your husbands, is under the assumption that you have a godly husband. Okay. That is setting a good example. If you have a husband that says we shouldn't go to church ever, don't submit to him. Go to church. Okay. But the flip side is the ideal, I think, is that if you have a husband that is trying to get the family involved, that is trying to teach their children about God, then people should be following that lead. So if the husband is leading towards God, then the family is supposed to follow that lead. All right. The part that people leave out is the next verse, and this is why I stopped. Because everybody's like to say, it says, wives, submit to your husbands, wives, submit to your husbands. And even a secular Buddhist only mentioned the fact that wives are being commanded to submit. Didn't say this next part. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. How did Christ love the church? What did he do to show his love for the church? Jesus died for the church. And this passage, after telling women or wives to submit to their husbands, again, under that assumption that the husband is leading the family towards God, all right, it then goes on to say, husbands, you have to love your wives. And that means being willing to die for them. How else did Jesus love the church? He served them. Jesus came to serve, not to be served. So what's that mean for husbands? If husbands are commanded to love as Christ loved, that means husbands should be in a position of service, all right, to their wives. They should be serving their wives. So you can't read one without the other, all right? There are, in a sense, submissive elements going both ways. There's wife, follow your husband's lead if he's being a godly husband. Wife or husband, serve your wife, just as Christ served the church, all right? And so part of whether or not you should submit to a husband, and I don't want to start a whole bunch of family squabbles here about people going back and forth saying, well, I'm not going to follow you because you didn't, rub my feet last night, or you didn't do the dishes, or, but the overarching vision here is one where a husband's entire attitude is one of self-sacrifice for his wife, all right? His entire guiding principle of the marriage should be to serve his wife, to love his wife, to lift her up. And women, if you have a man, your goal is to, if you have a relationship that's doing that, is to follow his lead. Because if you have a man who's loving you as Jesus loved the church, then that man should be pointing you towards Christ and pointing the family towards Christ, in which case, yes, that's why you're supposed to submit to that lead and follow that lead. Because if we do that, we have loving relationships, we have relationships based on service, we have relationships based on love, and we have relationships that are pointing the entire family toward God. All right? This says nothing about value. It says nothing about worth. Again, in context, nothing here says that God thinks women are somehow less than men, and so they have to serve them all the time, no matter what. Actually, the one that's supposed to be doing all the serving, it says here, is the man, is the husband to the wife. It's just setting up these roles and responsibilities that people have in order to have healthy relationships and to have godly relationships. All right. That one makes sense?
Makes sense to me.
All right. Well, those were the questions that we got on Reddit. There's a bunch more. I'm not going to go through them all right now because, well, we're already about 3:48, so I think we're reaching the end of our program here.
Yeah, we're kind of at the limit.
But I will direct you, there is, under the Bible study section here on our YouTube channel, you can find a playlist from that class that I mentioned earlier here called Cracking Open the Hard Parts of the Bible. And if you looked at that playlist, one of the classes that's on there will be, I think I phrased it the opposite way for that one. Does God value women less than men? Whereas this one I said, does God value men more than women? Completely different questions, of course. No. It's flip-flopped it. But there is a class in there that's going to dive into some of the same general themes we talked about here today, but a lot of different Bible verses. So if you want to see some of the other verses that people raise sometimes to challenge this principle of equality, take a look at that class, and hopefully it'll help you out in there as well. And again, if you're not watching us live, throw your comments down below in the comments section. We'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So thank you all very much for watching. We are going to be live here again next Wednesday at 3 o'clock. And just by way of reminder, if you want to get your topic on the program, go ahead to that webpage, trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff. Fill out the form there and tell us what questions on your mind about Jesus, about the Bible, about God. What's really pressing on your heart? We'd love to know. We'd love to answer it for you here on the show. Join us again if you could join us live next Wednesday at 3 o'clock. Like the channel, subscribe, or like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video, and make sure you put your comments down there below. We really appreciate it. Thank you, BA, for everything today. Great job as always. Thank you to Trevor and Pastor Jay for your comments today. And thank you to all of you that are watching, whether you're watching us live or after the fact. We value you all equally. See you next week. God bless.